Welcome. Great to have you with us. Accuracy in academia, we try to keep track of what professors are saying and how it matches up to reality or not. And since it doesn't, it keeps us busy. So this is something that definitely is disappearing on a lot of campuses: literature. We're happy to have with us the author of The Politically Incorrect Guide to Literature, English and American. Ladies and gentlemen, Elizabeth Kantor.
Thanks very much. Thanks to Accuracy in Academia for asking me here. It is great to be able to talk to interns who are current or very recent college students, partly because I can kind of go light on the most unpleasant part of my message, which is about what English professors on college campuses are doing instead of teaching classic English literature. You folks have been on college campuses quite recently. You, in many cases, know more than I do about the terrible things that are happening in university English departments. In the Politically Incorrect Guide, which you saw, I did collect some course descriptions, stories, evidence about what's actually going on college campuses, and especially in English departments or wherever literature ought to be taught. And as you know as well as I do, or better, there are some pretty pathetic things are going on there. There are a lot of English professors who are teaching things that really can't be characterized as English literature at all, or certainly not great English literature. In the Politically Incorrect Guide, I've got some examples of folks who are teaching really bankrupt philosophies, Marx, Freud, the fraudulent memoirs of a Latin American revolutionary called Rigoberto Menchu. Subjects like Israeli film, the history of 19th century ballet, whole classes on pornography, which, as we know, is available nowhere. You need to study that in college. In other words, to cut to the chase, a lot of English professors give the impression that they'd rather teach anything besides the subject that you'd expect them to be teaching. I also make the case in the book that it's in fact even more dangerous and destructive when some English professors teach Shakespeare, for example, from one of any number of, I guess, postmodernists would be the umbrella term, perspectives. If your professor ignores Shakespeare altogether and teaches Deep Throat or Das Kapital, then you can go back yourself in your spare time and read Othello and Hamlet and Macbeth yourself. However, if your English professor sells you on a post-colonialist view of The Tempest, which is that the whole point of The Tempest is how wicked Western culture is to have oppressed third world cultures, or if your professor sells you on a feminist view of Shakespeare, in the Politically Incorrect Guide, I quote from one, I think there's somebody here from UPenn that I met. There's a professor emerita at UPenn who says a major project of Shakespeare's play Macbeth is the domestication of women. There's another professor that I quote who says Shakespeare is one of the people who's responsible for the gender roles that oppress women. Shakespeare, in that case, is not just an example of Western oppression of minority groups. Shakespeare is actually a source of that oppression. In other words, if Shakespeare hadn't existed, then perhaps women would not be oppressed as we all know we are today. If that's the take on Shakespeare that you get, then if you learn to see Shakespeare the way a feminist or a Marxist or a queer theory professor sees Shakespeare, then essentially you've been vaccinated against ever learning from Shakespeare at all. In the past, when college students or high school students or anybody, Lincoln reading on his own, read Shakespeare for several hundred years, people saw Shakespeare in America as the source of insights into human nature. They also saw Shakespeare as showing them a standard of beauty and excellence, a kind of a standard of what the best kind of entertainment was, and they could compare other kinds of entertainment to what Shakespeare was. We're more entertained than ever, but we're losing Shakespeare as a standard. If your professor sells you on Shakespeare as an example or even a source of what's wrong with Western civilization, if your professor sees Western civilization as essentially a source of oppression of various groups, whether it's gay people or women or people of color or people in third world countries, then you won't learn from Shakespeare, and you won't be getting the kind of education in higher culture that generations of Americans have gotten before. The question is, does it matter? What kind of a difference does it make that Americans don't learn about Shakespeare or Milton or Keats the way that they did a few generations ago? Is it really such a great loss or such a dangerous or destructive thing that English professors over the past 40 years have changed from being people who considered it their job to preserve high art culture into people who, in many cases, consider it their job to disrupt the preservation and transmission of our higher culture to the next generation? I'm going to argue that it matters a lot. That it's of absolutely vital importance that our literary heritage and the traditional way of educating students is vanishing. I'm going to make a kind of a complicated argument, but what it boils down to is I think that in the end culture is more important than politics, partly because culture is what really determines how politics turns out in the long run. A lot of people complain that Republicans have been winning elections over the past decade or two or three, but that somehow the culture keeps moving left. Even as we win elections, we don't always somehow get things moved in our direction, and I think the culture has a lot to do with that. I want to talk about culture in, really there are three senses. Culture in the sense of higher culture, T.S. Eliot, Shakespeare, etc. Culture in the culture war sense of those hot button issues, abortion, stem cell research, sex education in public school, gay marriage. But there's also culture in a third sense, which is the sum of the attitudes and beliefs and sort of mental habits that a civilization has. What happens in politics in the end depends on people's basic assumptions about reality. So I've written this list of questions that I go around reading to basically illuminate the kind of basic beliefs about reality that I think are part of people's culture. And you can see that all these questions are questions that conservatives would answer one way and then progressives or liberals would for the most part, answer the other way. And I hope you can also see that what people's beliefs on these questions are, in the long run, is going to determine what happens in politics and government. Question number one. Is human history essentially the story of the liberation of one group after another from prejudice and oppression? Question number two. Can we look forward to a time when warfare will have been eliminated from the world? The third question. Are the differences between men and women just cultural constructs? Is crime caused by unjust social structures? Is poverty caused by wealth? Is it acceptable to do evil that good may come of it? Or are there some absolute moral prohibitions that you should never break under any circumstances for any good reason? And finally, is Christianity basically a bad influence on the human race? The point of these questions is to illustrate that the real war for our culture is broader and deeper than just hot-button issues like gay marriage and so forth. And the more that you care about hot-button political culture war kind of issues, the more you should care about how those basic beliefs get established in people's mental makeup. Western civilization is what it is, and it is great, it is prosperous, it is a source of freedom and dignity for people because of Western culture. I don't have a time here for a full-bore defense of Western culture as a good thing instead of as a bad thing, which is what a lot of college professors will tell you. But just to draw your attention to a few points: the history of the abolition of slavery, the unexampled prosperity of the English-speaking world, which we take for granted, but which is lifting millions of people on the Indian subcontinent out of poverty. The fact that our country's an immigration magnet, that to such a degree that our border looks like a plate glass window of a shop with the noses of like half the world pressed against the glass wanting to get in. It seems like there's good evidence that we have a uniquely successful culture. And our culture, Western culture, has a specific content, certain habits of mind, certain beliefs and aspirations, the appreciation for certain realities. That culture is not genetic, it's something that we learn, that's passed down to us. We learn it first from our parents and in our families, but traditionally, Americans have also learned that culture and made it their own in a more intellectual, a more questioning way during their education. Intelligent people have been pointing out for well over 2,000 years exactly how higher culture, in the sense of being educated in literature, influences and helps support culture in the sense of the beliefs and ideas and aspirations of a civilization. That's why literature has been part of education in fact, for as long as there has been any such thing as education. Here's Aristotle explaining why it is that young men should learn music, which were poetry with a musical accompaniment. He said, because of the way the pleasure that it gives affects the character. He said, since virtue is about delighting and loving and hating aright, clearly nothing is more necessary to learn and to make a habit than to judge rightly and to delight in good characters and noble acts. In the Renaissance, Sir Philip Sidney made essentially exactly the same argument. He said that poesy, which he meant any kind of fiction, painteth the outward beauty of virtues. A moral philosopher can give you what Sidney calls the bare moral rule, but he can't motivate you. A storyteller shows you noble characters, and then you see something that you want. You desire to be like a great-hearted ruler like Cyrus, or a straight arrow kind of guy like Aeneas. You don't just learn to approve what's good, you learn to actually go after it. That's one reason that Sidney argues that poets are the bringers in of civilization. Western literature naturally tends to mold characters in the particular virtues that are typically admired in Western civilization. Human beings are not civilized in the abstract, they're civilized into a particular civilization. But American citizens today are not having their characters shaped by Beowulf, Chaucer, Shakespeare, Milton, Dickens, Faulkner, as American citizens were in the past. For the remainder of this talk, I want to just give a few examples of what college students could be learning in terms of really of character formation and intellectual development if English professors were still teaching great English literature in a sympathetic way rather than in a sort of a look at these horrible dead white males and how they ruin the world. Okay, here are my examples. From Beowulf, from Shakespeare's Henry V, from Faulkner's works, and this is true about Faulkner's novels, but it's also true about his Nobel Prize acceptance speech, which is just a great speech. And from Evelyn Waugh's great World War II novel, which is called Sword of Honor, and if you like Brideshead Revisited, you really should read Sword of Honor. Students might come to understand that war is sometimes necessary, that there is glory in the hero's courage and self-sacrifice. None of those great works of literature celebrates warmongering or unthinking patriotism. In fact, all of them contain large elements of criticism of the human pride, folly, and rapacity that cause wars. But each of those works is an invitation to learn to admire heroes and to aspire to military virtue, without which no civilization is going to survive. In the Politically Incorrect Guide, I've got a quotation from a professor who teaches English who says Beowulf is essentially not interesting to modern people because heroes are passé. He's a Marxist. They're no longer interesting, which he said before September 11th. So there's maybe a little more excuse for it, but it seems pretty silly now, I think. That's an example of an attitude that we could learn that really, in a way, is universal. I mean, there's no successful civilization that doesn't appreciate heroism, or at least it's not successful for very long. But I'm going to move on to something that really is unique to Western civilization, which is chivalry. English literature is, from Chaucer through Shakespeare to Jane Austen, really an education in the uniquely successful Western arrangement between the sexes. If you read Chaucer, you learn about courtly love, which a little bit before his day was really kind of a literary fad. The idea of putting a woman on the pedestal and acting as if just seeing her eyes would practically kill you, if you were in love with her. And you had to be her slave in order to get her to love you back. The feminist theory is that putting women on a pedestal like that is, and you can read about it in the Political Inquiry Guide, is really a kind of a trick of the patriarchy to sneakily keep women slaves all the time. It's not about respecting or honoring them. It's just a sneaky trick to stay in charge. But if you read Chaucer, you'll see that actually chivalry, putting women on a pedestal, was an improvement, and seen to be such, in the culture of the medieval England. Chaucer shows a kind of battle of the sexes between men and women, but he also shows that chivalry provides a kind of an alternative to the everybody out for himself battle of the sexes, men trying to boss women around, women trying to outwit the men. He shows us that chivalry gives us a model in which both a man and a woman are able to trust each other because there's a kind of a new respect in the relationship.